guys, and welcome back to Evaluating Legal Risk. This week, week 5, is a fairly important week because we are going to go through the whole risk assessment process. And this is obviously one of the key things that you'll need to engage with as you're moving into writing up your project. So looking at Whaling Gazillian's text for Chapter 3 is where you'll need to start. And let's just call that up and have a look at their overview of what you're meant to be doing and how you're meant to be engaging with this process. Okay, so looking at the text, what the authors do is they first scout around in the marketplace to see what else is out there, what risk management models are out there. And they have a look at ISO 31000, which is a standard that's very widely used. I think it's quite a good, rigorous model, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. They also have a quick discussion of the COSO model, which is a variation on the theme. And then what they do is they kind of pare it all down and give you a distilled 5-element process in which they recommend you go about engaging in a risk assessment. So first up, obviously, identification, analysis, evaluation, treatment, and review. And that's their kind of rather, as you can see here, simplistic diagram that they've come up with. Now, if you just skip over to, if you've printed it out, your HB 296 document, which is related to that ISO standard, you'll see that process set out for you in a nice diagram here. The thing that I quite like about this standard 296 is that it brings into the assessment process the whole idea of establishing context. And as we know from our discussions of D thinking, systems thinking, regulatory theory, going about this initial step of examining the context in which your assessment will sit, I think greatly enhances the prospects of your suggested treatment protocols, your treatment controls being successful. And for this reason, I think a lot of risk assessment that goes on out in the marketplace actually uses this model and doesn't omit that initial step. I think it's quite a sensible step to include. I was going to actually show you the Central Queensland University Risk Management Framework. However, wouldn't you know it, just as I was filming, the website went down. And so we're going to have a little look at the UQ Risk Assessment Framework. And here it is. Here's the UQ Risk Assessment Framework. You can see it's a direct lift from that ISO standard. So again, you've got the preliminary step being first and foremost establishing your context. Then you can go about doing your assessment, and your treatment protocols will be informed by your investigations as to context. The only thing I probably would add to that diagram is the whole concept of having a rather systemic view of things. So taking that notion of engaging with that preliminary step of context and having it wrap around the entire model so that you can see the whole process of risk assessment is carried out in the wider confines of the system itself. Okay, that kind of emphasises the whole systemic nature of things a little more clearly. So here's my representation of Whaling Gazillian's 5-step model. I think, as I've shown you in the materials, that perhaps it could be more usefully depicted as something like this. showing the global nature of what you're doing, showing the systemic nature of what you're doing. Diagrammatical niceties aside, if you skip back to the UQ risk assessment framework or your HP 296 standard or the ISO 31000 standard, you can see there that, and even with Whaley and Gazelian's model, the first substantive step in the risk assessment process is risk identification. And it's most important there that you don't have the risk identification just done by the legal team in vacuo, just sitting in their little cubicles and imagining for themselves what the risks might be that are inherent in the organisation. As a number of the standards and risk management models go on to discuss, you really need a fairly broad consultation with all of the stakeholders involved in your organisation that might be able to give you some ideas and feedback on what the perceived risks are. And in the UQ risk assessment framework, they actually have this nice little, I think they call it a risk prompt list. And here you can see all of the different risks that they have identified there running down the left-hand side. So business continuity, interruptions, the potential causes, the potential impacts, and the kinds of treatment protocols that they have anticipated might fix the problem. Down the left-hand side, as I started to say before, you can see the risks that they have come up with that typify the kind of problem that crops up for a university. So business continuity, that's a more general organisational issue, but engagement with industry, so a lack of third stream activities there by the university might be adverse for the university. Environmental risks, ethics, and that's a big one for research. Financial risk, there's two of those. If you wish to look at this risk prompter, it's at ppl.app.uq.edu.au. If you want to look at it in a little bit more detail, because I realise I'm kind of skipping through things. HR risks, there's a few of those. Interestingly, IT, rapid change, they have identified that as a typical risk that might crop up in a number of different departments across the university. Occupational health risks, project management, reputation, research, teaching, and so on. You'll see that in this risk prompter, they have actually come up with and listed most of the risks that we will be looking at, but rather interestingly, they don't specify dispute or litigation risk, which I think is a fairly large omission, and they don't specify non-contractual obligation risks, so a risk of breaching the university's duty of care, so negligence by the university or its employees for which it's responsible. So if you want to have a look at something that aligns more closely with the text, we look at Whaley and Gazelian's risk prompter. We can see that firstly, obviously, it's a lot more general than the very specific and very detailed UQ risk prompter. But usefully for our purposes, it goes through the general types of legal risk that we will be looking at in the back half of this term. So firstly, contractual risk, legislative and regulatory risk, non-contractual rights, that's essentially boils down to intellectual property. Non-contractual obligations, as I said just previously, that's your breach of duty of care, negligence risk, and dispute, the big one at the bottom there. So there are all of the different types of legal risk that we will be canvassing for the rest of this term. You can see this particular risk register is a lot more general than the UQ one, but it's intended to be much more general because this is a legal risk handbook intended to be used by many different kinds of organisation. So these are really just the main heads of legal risk, and obviously what the authors are intending that you do is you take this as kind of a template to your focus groups with your stakeholders within the organisation, and you give them plenty of note paper, and you expand and you drill down into each of these different types of legal risk and make them particular and specific to that organisational risk landscape. Okay, the kinds of risks that will crop up in that particular business. So really it's just a discussions prompter, and it's intended to capture, by way of brainstorming, all of the different types of things that can crop up. Okay, that's your legal risk identification step. So moving from risk identification to risk analysis, the text sets out a couple of different ways to analyse legal risk. And first it runs through what's often used in the marketplace, which is a risk impact matrix. And that just simply involves looking at two things, two benchmarks. The likely consequences of any given risk, how disastrous they would be for the organisation, and also the likelihood that that risk will actually eventuate. Okay, so what you are actually going to wind up with is something like what you've got here in the textbook. So you've got impact versus likelihood down there. You can see the sliding scale moving downward, moving towards more severe. And you're looking at the various different risks that have been identified and numbered in the previous step, and they're then entered into this matrix. Okay, so you've got the likelihood is running across the top and the impact down the side, and each of those risks has been slotted into that matrix there and assessed for its nature. So if you look at, for example, risk number 2, pretty much up the top in the middle there, you can see risk number 2 has been assessed as slightly likely, and it's really only of a minimal nature. So you're going to be treating a risk like that very differently to something like risk number 25 down on the bottom right there. It's pretty much certain that this risk is going to eventuate, and if it does, the consequences would be fairly dire. So that kind of risk is obviously a red flag and something that you would want to prioritise in the next step, which is evaluation. Now, the authors of the text don't particularly like this matrix because they say that there is a little bit of subjective analysis that goes on with this kind of thing. You are looking at each risk and you're essentially making a qualitative rather than a quantitative judgment about that risk. And I guess Matthew Whaley's experience within accountancy firms leads him away from anything that's qualitative and a bit more subjective and more towards something that's of a quantitative nature and hard data, if you will. So what the authors do is they search around and they settle upon a scenario matrix analysis method. Now here you can see a map of the way that their thinking proceeds. So they take each risk and they say, let's run that through two different scenarios. We'll go through a typical scenario and an extreme scenario. In both scenarios, the risk has actually eventuated, and we're trying to quantify what will happen for this organisation when that risk does actually crystallise. So With the typical scenario, you're looking at a direct impact assessment and an indirect impact assessment. Direct financial loss and indirect, more reputational kind of loss. The highest rating for each is then assigned to that particular typical scenario, and then you look at your extreme side of things. Again, you're looking at your direct impact, the consequences there, and the indirect impact, and you're measuring this in terms of financial loss. Again, you're looking and you're assessing the overall extreme impact, and then you're kind of moderating the two and saying, well, what is the overall impact of this risk? So here we've got the tables all filled out for their scenario matrices, and up the top you've got the financial consequences of that risk occurring, and in the middle there you've got the indirect reputational, as I said before, or regulatory customer service losses that could flow from that same risk. So compiling that all into your matrices, you can see in table 3.5 here, they've done the analysis for a particular risk. So you can see there the direct financial consequences of that risk occurring typically would be around £10,000. In the extreme scenario, it would be perhaps $500 million. The indirect losses are rated typically 2 out of 4. In this extreme scenario, perhaps 3 out of 4. Overall, typical and extreme, we are looking at an impact on the left there of 2 and 3, the highest of the extreme ratings. Overall risk, they're assessing at 3, which is the highest of both the typical and the extreme ratings. So they're erring on the side of caution, and they're lifting that risk rating up to the highest that has been assessed for that risk. Okay, so that is the way their scenario runs. And then they say, well, you don't have to assess the risks in the same way as you do for consequence / likelihood matrix. You simply enter all of these hard data figures into your table of identified legal risks. So looking at table 3.6, you've got your identified risks there on the left-hand side, moving from their most general description to drilling down and setting out exactly how that risk might eventuate and what the consequences would be. And then what they've done is they've entered that hard data that Matthew Whaley likes to play with, and they're saying, well, what's our financial losses of this happening? They're of the order of £10,000. Typically, the indirect forms of losses, customer service, reputation, and so on, would be an impact of 2 out of 4. If this was a really extreme case, you might find that we lost $500 million, and the reputational and other indirect losses would be a rating of 3. So you can see for someone that really likes hard data, this is a much more appealing way of presenting to the board exactly what would happen if each risk occurred. There is certainly less an appearance of less subjectivity. However, you can see in the process of arriving at those figures, there is still some subjectivity and forecasting that has to necessarily go on, because we're assuming that that risk actually hasn't occurred, and so you can't actually quantify it with real-world figures and real-world data. But nevertheless, it certainly looks a lot more hard and fast than perhaps something like the consequences / likelihood matrices that are used by ISO 31000 and the HB 296. So that's the analysis step. So then we proceed to the evaluation step, and if you're using a consequence / likelihood matrix, so the first kind of procedure that's outlined by Whaley and Gazzellian, and they kind of move it to the side. But if you're looking at the consequence / likelihood matrix, you're going to wind up with something like this kind of pretty coloured diagram here, where you've mapped out the likelihood as against the consequences, and you've got this red flag area where you've got your almost certain and quite serious risks on the left-hand side, down to the rather insignificant and rare risks on the right-hand side in the yellow there. This is the University of Queensland one, so they actually go ahead and map out all positive consequences of risks as well. And then they go ahead and look at, well, where are the risks that are in the red shaded area? Where are the risks that are in the yellow shaded area? And the whole process of going about evaluating really is about prioritising. You need to know what your organisation's risk profile is. Is your company or your organisation risk averse? That is, they have to be very conservative in the way that they treat their risks, and practically any risk, apart from a nil risk, needs to be tempered with some kind of control measure. And that's particularly the case in, for example, the health services industry. Or are they risk takers, and are they happy enough to accept the risks that go along with perhaps more serious consequences? So they might be prepared to accept the kinds of risks that are in the orange shaded area, and really they'll just devote their risk control measures to the risks that pop up in the red flag area. So risk evaluation is about going through the identified risks, looking at their nature, prioritising which ones have to be dealt with now, which ones we can deal with in the medium term, and which ones we can deal with later, or which ones we really don't have to address at all. That's the risk evaluation that accompanies the consequence / likelihood matrix. So moving to Whaley and Gazzellian's legal risk evaluation, we come back to table 3.6, and there's our nice little summary of the risk and its nature in the first 4 columns there, and the hard data on the right. What they say is then, by looking at this kind of analysis, it gives you the equipment to go about prioritising actions to treat this risk. Essentially what you're ending up with is a table that shows you at a glance the kinds of financial and reputational loss that's going to accrue from each risk, so that you can prioritise the treatment of those risks, and so that you can impose some form of controls around the risks to mitigate them. Okay, so that's essentially legal risk evaluation, that step. So Whaley and Gazzellian's approach, after going through their scenario matrices with their harder looking data, is to move from that table that identifies the risk and assigns it a dollar figure and a reputational loss rating. And for each of those risks that have been assessed, there should be, they say, a control measure. And what I like about, I guess, Whaley and Gazzellian's approach here is that it's quite detailed and it doesn't leave anything to chance. So whereas the consequence / likelihood matrices, they allow you to identify the risks and perhaps to prioritise the risks, those that need to be dealt with first, those that can be dealt with later. And it doesn't really prescribe any particular process for dealing with the control measures that need to be put in place. Whaley and Gazzellian have this nice little table in 3.7 where for every risk that they have rated, they go through and they put a description of the control, who actually has to take ownership of that control measure, who is responsible for keeping tabs on the implementation of that control measure, an assessment of whether or not it's working properly, and the reasons therefore. So have a look at table 3.7. I think it's quite it's a good procedure for, like I said, making sure that nothing's left to chance. So that is the treatment step, and it also kind of incorporates the monitoring and the review step as well. So that is a legal risk assessment process, step by step. Okay, so I'll leave it there for you to think about and ponder. I'll sign off because this has been a kind of lengthy video, but a very important one, kind of crucial for where your project will be headed. If you do have any problems or queries with the whole legal risk assessment process, note them all down, talk about them with me in the Zoom, and hopefully we can clear up any queries you have then. Anyway, I look forward to chatting with you soon, and if you like this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll talk with you in the Zooms or next week in the next video. Thanks guys.